All good? All right. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Board of Education Policy Committee meeting. Tonight is Tuesday, September 6th. The time is now 5:02. With this evening, I have Secretary Godfrey Azima and also board member Mary Ellen Flaherty Ludwig. Tonight we'll be presenting and reviewing series 2000 and 3000 policies with discussion and any questions that we may have. At the moment now on the agenda, I don't have any public comments. Do we have any comments online?
Not at this time.
And also, did everybody get a chance to read the minutes from last month? And if so, are there any changes or questions or anything?
No changes, but I do have a question that we are continuing to talk about the policies. I mean, that'll be the next agenda, the ones that we need to either change slightly or yes,
Yes.
Ralph is nodding, yes. So, I mean,
Yes.
that's, everything looked good in my eyes. I would make a motion to accept the minutes.
Okay. Most accepted by Mary Ellen. Godfrey, any changes?
No, none whatsoever. Fine with me.
All right, so all in favor of accepting the minutes, say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Okay, thank you. So now at this moment, I am going to transfer the meeting to Ralph Alanzisi. Thank you, Ralph.
Oh, great. Thanks, Diana. And good evening, everybody. So to Mary Ellen, just before I get started, though, you are correct. Our goal over the summer was really to review all of the new model policies that we adopted, knowing, though, that there's going to be regulations, there's going to be some edits that we're going to need to make. So we'll be constantly going back and taking a look at certain things. But you know, I think right now we've narrowed it down to our last two sets of policies. We've reviewed the 5,000, 6,000, 9,000 series, the 4,000 series that deals with staffing. We reviewed the 9,000 series at the board retreat. And tonight we have two series, one that's pretty quick, which really Barbara will review, talking more about retention of records. So it's pretty straightforward, three different policies and what they are. And then I know Linda's going to take over at that point to talk about our finance policies. And there are a couple of edits that, you know, he'll kind of address quickly that we need to make. There's some clerical things in there. So just even naming structures, correct, Linda? Like if it's not purchase, it may say purchase services, we need to change it to purchase property services, make sure that everything's in alignment. But overall, I know, Linda, I'll let you kind of like review the policies and just talk about what's there, what was there in the past. So with that, if there's no questions, I'll pass it off to Barbara to get started with the 2000 series. And let me share out my screen.
Thanks, Ralph. So as Ralph said, there's only 3 in the series 2000, but also Ralph, I think on the last date we had discussed I would make proposed edits to the nepotism policy for everybody to review. So let's move through these 2000s because I don't believe they should be that difficult. Ralph, I can share my screen because I have all 3 of them open.
Oh, perfect. Yes.
Yeah.
Let me do that then.
Yeah, that's what I think I have. Okay, wait. Share. Hold on 1 second. Can everybody see 2003 uniform treatment of recruiters?
Yes.
Okay. So this is just kind of, we want to make sure that equal opportunity and access is happening to the students enrolled in the district. So we want to make sure that we have the appropriate and comply with like federal mandates about equal opportunity. So this is the extent of the policy, right? We want to make sure our recruiters, our students, everyone has access and equal opportunity. Obviously, if you look at the last paragraph, on an annual basis, the school district will notify parents of secondary students of their right to object to the disclosure of the student's name, because even though, you know, we might be sending it to institutions, college institutions, et cetera, some parents might not be on board with that, and that's fine. That just kind of covers us in terms of sending out information. Should I move to the next one, or does anybody have any questions? Okay. We have 2002, which is our policy regarding the retention of electronic records and information. And basically it says we are a school district, therefore we need to maintain all documents, and that means electronic documents. So we store everything electronically. Even Ralph can kind of speak to this. We don't delete anything. We don't get rid of anything. Even if somebody leaves the district, all of their information gets stored and remains.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, as far back as we've actually had email, we actually store that information, as well as any type of network, like if they save things onto a network drive, those types of items, all of the data is saved on a regular basis annually.
Yeah, and so we also comply with the municipal records retention schedule. We even have a copy laminated in our file room and here in HR, so that way we're, you know, making sure that we are keeping track and keeping records and documentation, but also knowing when it's time when we can kind of move them out of here. And generally, everything's going to be kept forever.
Barbara,
Yeah.
so just this is a comparison to when we had paper copies and now, but if a student were to leave the district, you're saying that we would send information to the new school system that they'd be going to, but we'd also retain a copy of information we have about them. Am I understanding that correctly?
Absolutely. We have one particular individual who deals with student records, because people come back years and years later saying, hey, I want a copy of my student records. And so we are required to have a copy. And so even though they've been paper copied, we keep, you know, student records basically indefinitely.
Thank you.
Sure. And then our last one, unless we have any questions. The destruction of electronic information and paper records. We comply with state and federal regulations. So we comply with the scheduled, the municipal schedule, but also it talks about during the course of litigation. So, and just so everybody's aware, if litigation is happening, we will receive a notice from Corporation Counsel, whoever's representing us, that we have to maintain any documentation that might be relevant. So we are always supposed to comply with that as well. And I think that's why it talks about this destruction of electronic information, paper records, because really we're supposed to keep copies of everything, whether it be electronic or the paper copies. And then we also have a duty if there is litigation, right? The point is nothing really supposed to leave the district. You don't really destroy records generally, except pursuant to the timeline. And even then, we want to be cautious. And so we have a number of records. What we keep here live in the building versus what's in storage, that kind of corresponds to that schedule. But going back, when we have litigation, our attorney will generally send a letter that the court mandates, and it says, hey, you know, if you have any of this information electronically or on paper, you are under an obligation not to destroy anything, remove anything, delete anything. And we always comply with that. So that has never been an issue, or at least not during my tenure here. I've not seen it become an issue before the court. Okay. And then I'm going to stop sharing this screen unless anybody has any questions. Oh, and I'm sorry, that was the one page for our policy. And unless anybody has any questions, we can kind of go back to the nepotism briefly and see what your thoughts are. Stop sharing this screen. Share my screen. Just make sure. One more time. Nepotism. Okay, can everybody see our nepotism policy?
Yes.
Yes.
So here are just briefly some of the changes. We left the definitions: immediate family, relative, familial relationship, and it kind of goes down, right? Like immediate, and then there's a secondary layer. You're getting farther and farther away from that kind of immediate family. For prohibitions on hiring, we added no relative or immediate family member, right? These kind of closer individuals. The superintendent of schools shall be hired to any position of employment unless approved by the board, right? Because look at relative. If we look at the definition of relative, it could be an aunt, an uncle, a niece, a nephew, a first cousin, a stepchild. So we don't really want to limit ourselves. And really, ultimately, there's that kind of, you are kind of providing that insulation in that there wouldn't be a conflict because anyone with these familial relations to the superintendent would really need to be approved by you. And so then the next two areas are restrictions on employment of relatives and restrictions on employment of immediate family members. Really, these were mimicking, they were the same language, but they apply to those different family relationships, right? So it was the same language. So we kind of consolidated to see if we can get the same point across. So we had no employee may be involved in the process of screening for advancement from anybody in their relative or immediate family, which that is something I don't think we would really have a problem with, right? We want to make sure that if you are an employee, you don't get to screen or review the application of any of your family members. And that's not something that's difficult to do, so we can kind of ensure integrity in this process. We said employees will not be hired, promoted, transferred, or assigned to work in positions in the same work unit, right? Because we don't want to limit ourselves just to the schools. We also have here at central office, unit or department in which a relative is already employed, unless the superintendent or a designee, right, the deputy superintendent, approves such an assignment in writing. And what we want to do is we want to make sure, okay, there might come a time where we might need to promote or transfer somebody into a position, maybe outside of the school into central, vice versa. And they're already employed in the district. And so what we want to do is we want to create that, we want to ensure if they're moving that it's been approved. It's not something that's verbal. We have something in writing. We have a record of why. And it just kind of makes that process a little bit smoother and less controversial. No administrator or supervisor shall supervise any of their relatives or immediate family. I don't think we want any position where somebody is supervising anybody that they're related to. And of course, if you're like, well, going back, what about the superintendent hiring somebody to a position of employment? Again, that's going to be approved by you, and that's a very specific and unique circumstance. But in general, we don't really want employees supervising other family members. Lastly, employees will not be hired, promoted, transferred, or assigned to work in positions in which they will have access to confidential information regarding a relative and or immediate family member. And so the reason, likewise, we don't want them supervising, we don't want them having access to these confidential documents. You could be a family member and you might not be particularly close, and you wouldn't want that wall to come down where somebody might have access to it. Granted, this is a professional environment and nobody should ever be discussing or utilizing, but that really is just an insurance policy to make sure that that is never even a question. Lastly, so the reason we got rid of this portion is because what we did was we removed that and consolidated up into this restrictions on employment. Then we have the disclosure requirements, right? And we always want somebody to disclose these relationships because it prevents an issue or conflict with the employees that the district, we're all aware, we all know, and you know, it just kind of takes away that, even if there's not that kind of air of impropriety. If there's a change in circumstance that creates a familiar relationship between an employee and his or her supervisor, the board, through its superintendent, reserves the right to seek a transfer of any employee in order to resolve any concerns with respect to issues of nepotism, right? Because we understand that sometimes that can happen. Relationships change, people can become family members, whether directly or indirectly, you know, through marriage. And we also added this: the superintendent may also provide for the evaluation and or supervision of the employee outside of the typical chain of command in order to resolve any concerns about nepotism. And so we don't want to put the district at a loss of a potential great staff or employee and preventing them from moving into a position. But if we want to, we understand that there could be, again, there could be unique circumstances that require this move, and then it creates that former position that we talked about. Okay, well, they shouldn't really be supervising. And so we can, you're not required to, right? The superintendent may provide an accommodation basically in the chain of command to ensure that there's no nepotism or appearance of nepotism. Does that kind of make sense to everybody? You know, we don't want to violate our own policies, but there, you know, there's always an exception. A board member or administrator who knows that his or her relative or immediate family member has applied for a position shall declare such relationship to the superintendent or the chair of the board as soon as practicable. I don't think anybody would have a problem, right? If you have your relative or immediate family member, and we're just gonna, you know, again, it prevents an issue with the staff member, it prevents an issue with the district. And we always want the best, and we don't want to, you know, cut ourselves off from having potentially really great staff members because of a possibility of a family relationship.
Barbara, when we do that, do we incorporate a question in the application so that if a family member doesn't think of taking the initiative to mention it, that it's in the application itself, so then they are reminded, oh, you know, do you have any relatives? And you, with the definition of what relative means, could even be in-laws. So that I'm just
that's a possibility. That's a great recommendation, and that's a possibility. And I can talk to our director here, Lisette, about adding that possibly to the workflow or to the questions that are asked for incoming applicants.
Correct, because that will fill the need of disclosure. But I could imagine a number of situations where you might not think of disclosing, you might not think of initiating that, not trying to be difficult, but just not thinking to initiate that. I'm a cousin by an in-law, and you just, you know,
so kind of, nothing, there's no like malintent, or you're not trying to, you know, hide anything. So, it just might not occur to you. And so, I think that's a really good suggestion. So, and we can kind of look into it as adding it, you know, to what happens here in HR, just to kind of support this language in the policy. Right. So they not, and to make sure the question isn't saying, are you, do you have an immediate relative, but just giving the same definition we have here. Definitions, so right? Immediate, relative, familial. So that way we're kind of in the know. Yeah. And if you could back up to page number 2, we're in the middle. Yeah. I have a question about that. Sure. A little bit lower. Oh. Yeah. Right about there. What are where are we looking? Okay. I'm just reviewing it now. So the part that says no administrator or supervisor shall supervise any of their relatives, that connects directly to what you were saying in the 3rd page, that the superintendent could realign who supervises whom to make sure
the relative is not being supervised by somebody related.
Yes. And that's a may situation, right? It's not a can, it's she may, if she,
Yes.
if she determines in her discretion that that's appropriate for this position.
And so I think the other thing that comes up is, and this is life, this is, if you're working really hard and you don't have a lot of extra time, so often people meet at work. And so
Yes.
relationships blossom, and now 5 years later, you're married. And we don't want to create a situation that somebody can't work in the system within the NOAC system because they're married. There should just clear that it sounds like they could actually still work in the same school, but just not have the chain of supervision, have one of their, spouses be supervising.
Exactly. No.
Yeah.
I think you hit the nail on the head. And there could also be the discussion of transferring somebody, but that language really does give us the chance to make sure that we're retaining people if relationships change.
That's a
Yes.
good one. So correct me if I'm wrong, Ralph. We need to, if we have no more questions,
Oh, sorry.
that's okay. Approve this to move it to the full board.
Yes, this would be one that we want to be able to move forward for approval, so.
Okay. So any other questions before we vote? All good?
No, nothing on my end.
Okay, so motion to approve to move this policy to the full board.
Can I wait just 1 second? I have one more question about this policy. The last sentence in red, a board member shall not be an employee of the school district. Isn't that in another policy, or we're just repeating it? I've read that before.
You know what? It may be in the board policies.
I was
about
just
the
gonna
board-
say
the
it's-
board.
It's in our policy, not the schools, not the districts.
Okay, so now we're just putting it in the districts.
Correct.
Okay, no problem. Just clarity is good. Thank you. I'm ready to go ahead. Go ahead,
Would you
Diana.
like to motion it?
I make a motion that we
Move it to the full
Forward.
board.
move this amended nepotism paper to the full board, that we're moving it to the full board for a vote.
Thank you, Mary Ellen. All in favor, say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
I
Aye.
didn't hear, oh, there's Godfrey. Okay, so it's unanimous. Unanimous vote to move it to the full board for vote. Thank you. Thank you, Barbara, for everything in the description.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara.
Definitely, thanks.
And I'll hand it over to Ralph.
Okay, great, thanks. And Diana, just normally, when we normally have our policy meetings, it'll actually fall throughout the year on the night of the workshop
Mhm.
meeting. So then it would go to the following business meeting for approval. This month, it's backwards. We're actually. doing
Yeah,
the
we
business
flipped
meeting
it.
tonight.
Mhm.
I will ask Dr. Stray and stuff. I think and the board chair, if we can actually move this on the workshop meeting instead as a vote. I think it just makes sense instead of trying to cram it in or add it to.
Yes. I'm good with that too. And
Great.
usually it's on the agenda, but we didn't have it on the agenda to vote on it. So
Yeah,
we
yeah,
might-
and
we might want to update that.
okay. We
Thank
will,
you.
Definitely. Definitely. And our next agenda item, and our last one for tonight, is to review the finance policies. So I'll turn it over to Linda. And Linda, would you like me to share my screen with the policies? And would that make it easier for you, or?
Sure, you can share.
Okay,
And Ralph, based on what our conversation on Friday, there are a couple of, similar to what Barbara did, kind of walk through what some of the suggested edits are. But we're not voting on these. We're gonna update these and then bring it back for a vote, if a vote is necessary? Is that the process?
Yes, yeah, for any modifications, and at that point it will be, yes, so.
Okay. So yeah, so we could go through these. So the first one is the budget transfers and line item transfer procedures. You'll see me bring budget transfers tonight, and you've seen these throughout the month. And so this just talks to that process. The first thing that I would like to point out are these categories here, these major categories of line items. These are not necessarily the major categories we use here in Norwalk. So we will update the category names and the category titles because each district does theirs differently. But other than that, that's the only suggested change that we would be making on this page. And then if you go to the second page, Ralph, on the transfers, the periods covered, if you go to the top, it says that the board will receive monthly reports. Quarterly reports is the threshold, and you'll receive these quarterly reports like July, August, and September, and October. Our process has been actually more detailed. We bring these reports to you monthly rather than quarterly. So I don't think that we need to change the standard, but we're doing more than the minimum. I think the minimum is the quarterly reporting. We are still doing monthly reporting, so I would leave it at the monthly level, even though the policy says quarterly, just to give us some room. For example, at the end of the year, you haven't seen a report from me during the summer months, right? Because we didn't have a board meeting during the summer months. We're doing year-end close, and so much is changing before the end of the year. So typically, the first report you're going to see is the August report. We don't bring you a June report because June is rolled over to year-end, which is what I'll go over tonight. So I think the quarterly schedule is fine, but we will provide a more detailed reporting. And I think the other thing I wanted to add to this, it says the superintendent is authorized to make transfers up to 5% of the annual budget, which is a big threshold. I think we have a practice or policy where our threshold is 10%. And so the 10,000, sorry. So we bring to you 10,000 transfers, although like you allowed at the end of the year, you bring us blanket authorization for year-end close to go above that without your prior approval. But then once we've completed those transfers, we bring those back to you. So you'll be seeing a series of transfers tonight that you gave the superintendent authority as part of the year end to do transfers in excess of 10,000, with the understanding that she is to come back, tell you what those transfers were, and then we go back to the normal routine of anything over 10,000 requires your approval. And then I think the other changes we'll be suggesting to this is just there's some place where it refers to town manager or first selectman, and we'll just update those to reflect City of Norwalk and the mayor, those types of things. But other than that, I think this policy is good to go, policy 3001.
Okay, so we'll add this to the next meeting with the red line, with the red changes?
Yes.
Any questions from board members? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Linda, for that very detailed
Thank you, Linda.
conversation there.
So the next one, Ralph, is 3002.
So, sorry, I'm just trying to scroll through.
Right, and I think the other thing too, in these model policies, we have two sets of each. There's one that is for a regional education authority and a local education authority. So we're a local education authority, and that's the model that we follow. The regional one doesn't necessarily apply to us, although both are included in the handout. So we're going to model against the local education authority. So 3002 is actually procurement and a federal award. This is one, obviously, through ESSER funding and the ARPA funding here recently, is one that we've paid close attention to because we have received additional federal funding than we have typically. And so again, the same changes here. You'll see, like, for the purpose, there's that blank line where we would insert Norwalk Board of Education and those types of things. But the code itself is consistent with our practice. So we will bring this back to you with very few red lines because it is applicable to us. The next one is 3003 series, which is the disposable of obsolete of properties. And this was actually something that also came out of the efficiency study, is how we dispose of properties, how we tag properties that we acquire. And this just speaks to how we dispose of those things. And essentially it goes through a series of a hierarchy. If one department has an item that they wish to dispose, the first thing is we would look at, is there another department within the district that could use that before it gets disposed of? If there is no one within the district that has a need for that property, then we would reach out to the city and to ensure that no one at the city has a need for that property. And if nobody at the district and nobody at the city has a need for that property, then we would do the disposal of that property, whether by auction or surplus sale. But before we do that, we need to ensure that no entity in the district and then no entity on the city side has a need for that before we dispose of any surplus property. And again, we would just change the semantics. You'll see here it says town manager or first selectman. We would insert there the title that applies to us. And so this one is also good to go. The next one is gift grants to the districts. And this basically says, and this is also, I think it's also part of our, we also have a code of conduct as well. And it just speaks to the acceptance of gifts and their dollar thresholds. Anything over $500, we have to disclose the principles. It's common, especially during Christmas time. You get a bottle of wine or a bottle of pop or a can of popcorn or whatever. And so this kind of just makes sure that we are consistent with that and their dollar threshold, and anything above, if anything is valued over $500, we need to notify the superintendent that we've actually received that. And so this is again consistent with policies in other places. And so we will also bring this back to you with some red lines as well. And then, so this is compliance with the IDEA grant. The IDEA grant is Individual Disabilities Education Act. And so we receive several grants for the IDEA funding. These are funds that are strictly for our students with disabilities, and it just speaks to what we can do. It actually is in line with the federal grant requirement that we saw at the very beginning, but the IDEA grant is a bit more specific because of we're serving students with disabilities. And so again, this just speaks to what we can do with that funding, appropriate reporting of the funding, and ensuring that the dollars are only used for disability education related activities. There is not much change here other than just some semantics and wordsmithing on this one. And I think the one that follows here is 3006. So 3006 is the purchasing policy, and I wanted to spend some time on this. Dana, you'll recall last year, right around the time I started, this committee had worked with Tom Hamilton and Karen Bartron on the purchasing policy update. And part of that update had to do with the prior year's audit, where there were certain things that were highlighted from the auditors that needed to be in the purchasing policy. So we actually adopted policy 3323, which had incorporated many of the things on this policy, plus some of the requirements of the federal grants. What I had suggested to Ralph, and what I would suggest to you, is that I feel that 3323 policy, which you had adopted, I think was back in April or May of last year, actually covers what this policy would, and a little bit more. So my recommendation is, because right now we have two purchasing policies, 3006 and 3323. So I would recommend that you use the 3323, which is the one you had adopted, and also meets the requirements of the audit. As part of the state audit this year, that was actually something that they cited, and we used that to satisfy their questions, and they were fine. And so that's the one that they have on record for us. So that would be the only change. So when we bring these back, I'll bring back that 3323 policy and provide some additional clarification.
Okay. Yeah, that was a long one.
Yes.
Yeah, it was. And Tom had prepared a memo, and I can include that as well. He had put together a memo that described what the changes were and what we were doing. And this one also includes, I think, Ralph, what you have also includes some appendix.
Yes, it does.
Yes.
Yeah, so this was a long one, but the policy itself is only about 5 or 6 pages without the appendix. But that's what we will be bringing to you. And the appendix are really just quotes from the federal statutes. And Ralph, I think that was.
That's it, right?
Oh, and then there was one more. The last one is 3007, the student activity funds. School activity funds.
Yeah.
And if you recall, this was one, we actually spoke about this at the retreat as well. This was one of the items that were also cited by the efficiency study, that we do needed to have a more centralized management of the school activity funds, which is something we've already started to do in finance. We know that we have, these are all created mainly by either the SGCs or the PTA organizations for specific purposes. And over time, some of the individuals that open these accounts have either retired or they've moved district and are no longer with the district. And currently it's not centralized. And what this policy does is it goes hand in hand with our efforts to centralize student activity funds and to make sure that the people that are managing these funds are bonded. Central office or finance doesn't necessarily manage these for the schools, but we have oversight, making sure that they're in the right with the right bank, in the right investment vehicle. For example, we have some activity funds that are in a bank that charges you a fee for inactivity. Which is no reason, because we have other accounts that have activity, and so if these were pooled under one umbrella, you wouldn't get dinged for a student activity account that is inactive or doesn't have periodic transactions and is basically just giving away money that's been raised by the parents. And so this just speaks to good financial management and oversight over these activity funds to make sure that they provide the results that are intended by the schools that originated them. So those are the 3000 series accounts that we had reviewed for you, and we'll be bringing back some red line versions of that. Thank you, Ralph, for putting that together for us.
No, definitely. Thank you, Linda. And so I think that was our main agenda for tonight. I do know, though, that Janine had sent me a question prior, talking about our attendance policy. And Janine, just to get some clarification, the question was really to be able to help create almost an easy cheat sheet for parents to understand, our attendance policy. And I think more so than the policy, we really want to do a cheat sheet for the regulations and the procedures that we follow, because I think that's probably the most important piece for the parents to understand. And correct me if I'm wrong, that they understand, like what's considered absent, what's considered tardy, what's, how many days is truant and so forth.
Yes, and they're looking for a clarification, where they should be looking for that information to make sure that they have the accurate information on that.
Yeah, so currently the old policy, which was really the regulations that were there, bringing it up, let me see if I can get to them real quick. I know you're not going to be able to read this on the screen. Let me go to shop. So these are actually the policies and regulations that are currently in board docs that talk about elementary, middle, and high school attendance and explain what each one of the different types of absences are.
Okay.
This is available there, but I do think what I would recommend is that we come up with better language in this to make it easier for parents to understand. So that is something that we can look at addressing and taking the same regulations, because once again, we've adopted the policy. This is actually just the regulation itself that we would want to kind of put into a language that's actually a little bit more easy to digest and make sense. And then if there are things that need to change, it's actually easier to change them on an ongoing basis.
Right, for sure. Thank you, Ralph.
Do we have a appeals policy within our regulation, like an attendance appeals policy?
Well, we did have an appeals policy, I know, for credit denial at the high school level. I have to go back and check on to make sure that we had an appeals policy for an attendance issue, but I believe that in the regulations itself, it says if there's a discrepancy, I'd have to go back and make sure that I know what would be the steps for a parent to follow in order to appeal that or question if there's a question about an absence or a tardiness.
Yeah, and also an appeals process, understanding the ramifications of absenteeism, at all levels. And the trigger is always, where your attendance puts you in the red zone or anything concerning, whether it's mobility to next grade and high school. I definitely see it be more of a need to have it clarified. What that process is, because it could be a quarter to quarter thing, it could be applicable for a whole year thing or semester. And I think sooner folks are able to see the appeals, whether it's documentation or just a starting place to, present information that may prevent a collateral impact the following quarter or semester.
And Gottfried, I would think too that actually is truly in alignment with the grading policy, because when it comes to the high school level, that attendance ties directly back to a denial of credit and students earning credit and so forth, making sure that they've had access to their education and have learned what they need to. My assumption, this will be something that I'll follow up with too with Dr. McBride, because I know he's working on grading policies. So this may be something that should be addressed around that time frame and at the same time.
Yeah.
Great. So Diana, if I can, what I've heard tonight, unless anybody has any more questions, I don't want to cut anybody off.
I'm good.
Okay.
Anybody else?
No,
No, it sounds good.
Okay, so for what we want to do then for the next board meeting is move forward the idea that we talked, we've already voted on the nepotism policy as redlined. We're moving forward. Are we going to vote on bringing the finance policies forward as well at the same time, knowing though that we bring back policy 3323 in comparison to 3006, which you adopted in the spring?
I don't know if we would move that one forward now because we haven't seen the changes as Linda would like to. I mean, we understand them, at least I do since I'm on finance, but not all board members are on the finance committee. So I would like for that to be shown to
Public?
them and discussed, please.
Okay,
But as long as we have the timing right and everything, so that we can look at it back, like we did today with the nepotism.
yep, we'll make sure that we have those red line options there for the October meeting for finance. And hopefully then to move forward for approval. The only other one that was outstanding at the moment that I think may be what I'd call low-hanging fruit is earlier this year, we reviewed our social media policy. And we actually took the model policy that we adopted, and in the spring, we changed a little bit of the language in it already. The recommendation was at that time when we talked about it was, do we just go back to the one that we adopted in the spring, because it was based off the model policy that's in place. But yet we've already made the changes that, like I said, Linda is going to be doing for the October meeting, which was just basically redlining it and approving it. So I would actually recommend that one moving forward too, because it is something that's a quick policy that probably doesn't need to be reviewed again, since it's only been a few months.
Right, because we just did it and it was a long one.
Yeah, that makes sense. I remember doing that.
Mhm. So we're going to approve it now then?
Yeah, I guess it would to move it forward as well. So the nepotism and the social media policy as it was prior,
Prior.
be placed back.
All right, so motion to approve the nepotism and the social media policies that we approved and reviewed actually this year within the last, 4 months, I believe. Anybody want to motion both together?
I so move.
Thank you, Janine. Seconded by Mary Ellen. I saw her hand up. All in favor, please say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Okay, so that's unanimous on both. The nepotism and the social media policy. Forwarding it to the Board of Ed for approval.
Great.
All right. Was that it for our agenda for this evening?
Yeah, just I think the one thing for the October agenda, then I've got the finance red lines that we'll look at to hopefully move those forward for approval for the 3000 series. And the only other thing I would recommend that I'll put on the agenda is, as I mentioned, with adopting these model policies, Shipman and Goodwin each year will have some policies that they see state regulations have changed. They had about 3 of them. So I'll actually add those to the next agenda item, and they're minor changes, but they're changes to the model policies that we actually just adopted already. And that's something that we want to do on an annual basis, just to make sure we're in compliance. So if I could add those 3 on, and then we'll review those as well.
I am good with that, especially with the timing. Like, we did really well today. If you see that there's a policy besides those that are needed to have to be updated sooner rather than later, if we can put it on the agenda as a possibility, since we have the time to be able to discuss anything new moving forward.
Definitely. Yeah, because I do think that once we get to the grading policy, I think that's going to be one that will take some time.
Right.
There'll probably be a couple of others, but I will, I'll review. Barbara, I'll meet with you too. So we'll see if there's anything that's, once again, low hanging. I keep saying low hanging fruit. Ones that are a little bit quicker.
Sounds good. And we can discuss it later and see what policies we're moving forward for this year.
Yep.
So it was a good meeting today. Thank you for everybody. I know that it takes a lot of hard work, and I know that it seems like easy peasy on our end, but I know that there's a lot of work in the background by the team and always keeping us, on top of things and legal and everything else. So thank you for this evening, and I will see you all in a few for our meeting this evening. So motion to adjourn. Mary Ellen, thank you. All right, good night. See you guys in a few. Thank
Good night.
you.
See you. Thank you.